You know, this is the first semester in 11 years since I've been in the classroom. And PE's down a faculty member, so they had a couple of courses that they needed to be taught. And so I can't say I jumped on them, but I took on the task. And I tell you what, it's good to be back in the classroom. I tell you what, after 11 years in administration, sometimes you just forget about what it's really like out there in the real world teaching. And so I jumped in there, got 27 students in an exercise physiology class, and I don't know if they're having fun, but I'm certainly having fun. And it's good to be back in the classroom, and especially now that, you know, we're doing these professional developments on engagement. We've got the book that we're reading through, and I actually read the book. And I thought, well, you know, I'll try some of this stuff. And so the first day, well, let me back up. If you remember in the first couple of chapters, they talk about really making, and I'm paraphrasing here, but making it more like a home type of environment where they love to be in the classroom. And you know, we in education teach that. I mean, it's been one of our learning outcomes is the environment of the classroom for years and years, as long as I can remember anyway. And so I thought about what can I do based on the book to try to draw them on day one. So what I did was I looked up on Banner where every kid was from. And interestingly, I got one from Canada and one from England. Of course, they're both athletes, but still, they bring some cultural things in there that we in the South don't really know. And so I went through there, and as I was calling roll, I would say, okay, you know, you're from Oxford, aren't you? And I would bring up something about Oxford, somebody that I knew down there to see if they knew them. And then I asked them to talk a little bit about what they plan to do for the rest of their lives. And you know, I had some that were really reluctant to talk about anything, but we spent almost the entire class, and I of course told them my background. I went from almost birth to close to death where I am now, and about my life, and so that they would know who I was and where I was coming from and what I'm doing here and all that sort of thing. And then again, I had them to talk about themselves, and even those who were reluctant would come up and say, well, I'm a nutrition major. And that'd be it. Then I'd have to probe them. Because I wanted them to talk in class and become comfortable in there. And you know, it worked. Because since day one, they come into class, they're smiling a little bit more, they're talking amongst themselves, because there were some people that had relationships in there because they knew of somebody that the other one knew that we talked about in there. And so they developed a little bit closer thing. So it worked. You know, regardless of what Mr. Margaret says about the book, it is a good book all the way through. And I, you know, if you're not engaging yourself in the book, I encourage you to do so. Because I promise you, it's like what you're going to hear today. I promise you there'll be something that you'll take out of that book that you didn't do before that's going to help you in class. I guarantee it. For me, I don't think I've ever been to a professional development where it's a conference or something in here that I didn't learn something. Or I didn't reflect on something and say, you know, that reminds me of something else. So I hope you're really engaging in all this stuff as we go through. The last thing I want to do is I'm in the process now of designing the reference letter for faculty around campus to fill out in order for the admission process in our undergraduate programs. And so I'll go online, I'm looking at some things, and I run across this little project this ninth grade student did. It was, and the title of her little project for school was Qualities of a Good Teacher, a Student's Perspective. Now this is a brilliant little girl, you might, if you read it. Penelope Placid is her name, she's a ninth grader. She says at the end in her conclusion, she says, research shows that students' opinion really matter. And it's time that they are heard. Teachers of the present and future. The survey data clearly shows that students think teachers should be dedicated to their job. Teachers need to be able to reach children emotionally and academically, making sure the material taught is understood. If you're not good at showing emotion, try. And if you're not good at making the classroom a home, put a welcome mat outside your door. Do all you can to provide a safe and warm environment for students, because according to the data, it makes a great deal of difference to students. From a teen's perspective, a good teacher is one that is has a good personality and a person who wants what is best for all students. not only do I know this is true by looking at the data, I know it because I've seen it. And so I just think that goes back that higher education is changing. The day of the sage on the stage where you lecture and you give a rat's rear, whether or not they get anything or not, you just look at the test, say you passed, fine, you didn't pass, you can take it over and move on. Those days are gone in higher ed. We've got to be more like that high school teacher in the way we teach, which is why all these professional developments, I think, are very important. Okay, I'm going to step off my soapbox and introduce the first presentation. Dr. Emily Sims, Department Head for Secondary Education, presentation is titled, "To Ask or Not to Ask, That is the Question, Promoting Student Inquiry Through Critical Thinking, Skills, and Self-Reflection." Dr. Sims.
Good afternoon. I want to begin with, first of all, just looking at our title, taking a minute just to look at the title, because I think this is the first way you begin to engage your students. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So let's just look at the title. Anything jump out at you? Any conversations you want to have? Shakespeare. What was the giveaway? Okay, so think about this for a second. Now, we haven't talked about a thing, but what do I already know you know? Shakespeare. That much of it. That much of it. Okay? So, Socrates. Okay? So I've got you pulled in and we haven't even started the lesson yet. So look at the subtitle, Promoting Student Inquiry Through Critical Thinking Skills and Self-Reflection. Those go hand in hand. You can't really critically think without self-reflecting. You can't really self-reflect without critical thinking. So the title in and of itself will begin to kind of gauge where we're going to go with this lesson. So just to give you some further confidence, Shakespeare. Now the person that responded Shakespeare, how do you feel about yourself? Genius, obviously. So you look at this quote here, and that title was there for a reason to kind of catch you, because many of us will know to be or not to be. It all began with this buzzword, and this questioning began here. To be or not to be, that is the question. What background knowledge? I don't want to take this ELA base because I want you to really think about whatever it is you're teaching, whatever discipline, teaching field, I want you to kind of morph what I'm talking about into what you're doing. But just to kind of set the stage, what background knowledge do you have about this? What do you know about just these two statements right here? We're going to come back to what we're doing right now just in just a minute also. Just remember this moment. What do you know? To be or not to be. What does that even mean? Self-reflection. Okay. Anything in specific? Okay. All right. It's pretty deep stuff, isn't it? Okay. And then what follows that is the question. So it's a question to be posed. Now here's what I find interesting about that. Okay, let's compare this. So we got the soliloquy and think about questioning. Is this not what happens when we question students? An internal struggle, a complex ideas. They begin to kind of navigate what they know and what they don't know. Profound concepts. Is that pretty much what that statement was about, to be or not to be? All those things? And so one of the things I believe you begin to do as you engage students is you kind of bring something they already know to something they may not know. And that in itself engages them because now I have some basis for where you're going with this. And now there's new information I'm going to pack onto that. So oftentimes we don't think about pulling things what they already know. I think it's really important what Dr. Hammett says, I can't do this unless I know my students. So part of what I've got to do is obviously I had knowledge that at least one person in here would know the to be or not to be. So I had to have some sort of knowledge about that. I wouldn't put something out here so profound that nobody would know, because then what we begin to have is a frustration level. We go from that productive struggle, which is what we're really trying to get to students to be at, because that's where learning occurs, to this frustration. I don't want you frustrated. So I knew I could have something to grasp on. But that's really where we're going with this on there, with questioning. I might need somebody to click this for me. It's not going when I do too, Russell. Yes. So we've been with this age-old debate we've had. Is teaching an art or a science? You guys heard this before? And we can begin to say really it's neither in and of itself, because it's both. If we kind of begin to marry this with what the arts is with teaching and questioning, so if pedagogy is the art of teaching, and teaching is the art of questioning, wouldn't you say then that effective teachers are both masters of the art of questioning and teaching? Because theoretically, can you separate the two? Are you teaching if you don't question? And if you're questioning, aren't you teaching? So you really can't separate the two. So I think sometimes we underestimate this power of questioning, and you've got some packets, so we're going to go over those items for you in just a minute. But I think we underestimate that, and we as educators, no matter what your level, my primary base as far as when I came into higher ed was secondary education. So the level of questioning, oftentimes people think you start here, and we are all familiar with Bloom's, but I put that back in front of you just as a reminder. I'm a firm believer that you put this in the hand of your students, because I want them to know where they're learning, and I want them to know how they may begin with the remembering stage at the very low level and recall, but by the time they leave my classroom, they're creating, and I want them to see that. So it's not enough for me just to tell them that. They've got to see it and visualize that. This is not a secret language we have in education. I think students need to know what learning looks like. And too many times it's like, I'll let you know when we get there. Well, let them know where we're going and then help them get there. And too many times that doesn't happen. You have in front of you a green sheet. Critical Incident Questionnaire. That's actually on page 328 in your student engagement handbook, so that's something you can look through. I pulled this because I think this married pretty well with what we're going to be talking about today in my session. But I also begin to realize no matter what your discipline is, it doesn't even matter. I don't even need to know what it is. I have no doubt that you can fit this with whatever you're doing into your class or lesson. This is Critical Incident Questionnaire. I want you to think about this as something you would use when your students are beginning to navigate very complex ideas or concepts within your discipline. It's not something you would put out there because it's called critical incident for a reason. Everything that's happening in your classroom is not a critical incident. So we need to begin to kind of let students know when these things occur, here are things I want you to address. I have this in front of you today because I actually want you to experience this. I think too many times we tell our students, here's what you need to do, but we never ourselves let ourselves allow us to experience that too. So you need to see this. So when you struggle through something, you begin to see as you present this lesson to students, I see why they struggle here too. So here are some things. You can change these questions any way you want. Now, the key to the critical incident questionnaire is once you've established your question, I think 5 is plenty. There's no magic number. You can go 3, you can go 7. But let's say you have your 5 questions. You don't change these questions as you go through the year. You pretty much, these are the questions. So you have to think about questions that can be revisited throughout your curriculum. One of the things today, and I kind of let this represent what we're going to be doing today, is as we go through this session, I want you to think at what moment in class were you most engaged. We're talking about student engagement. So as we go through my session, I want you to think about the time when you're most engaged. You're going to be reflecting as we go through this. We talked about self-reflection. And I also want you to think about the part of the session where you were least engaged, where you were so distant as a learner. You were thinking about what you just had for lunch and what you wanted more of. Right, Dr. Hammett? Okay? You're going to think about what occurred in class that you found most affirming or helpful. Maybe nothing, but maybe something. What occurred in class that you found most puzzling or confusing? And this goes back to that Hamlet, to be or not to. I mean, this is a good thing that you're confused and puzzled. That means you care about the learning. And then lastly, what surprised you about the class? We always have those aha moments, because that's one of the things to me is like I want to go into class unexpected, not expecting to learn something and learn it. And I think that anticipation, and you end with something like that, so that every time they come in there, they're anticipating this. Again, this is not something you hand out every day, but this is something they may have within their binder, and as things come up through the semester, hit this critical incident. How this benefits you as an instructor, there's going to be periods where you say, and this is one of the things that you want this completely anonymous, because as you collect this, if it's not anonymous, then the name's attached to this, and they're not going to be as candid on these responses as you probably need them to be. But this provides you with so much valuable feedback as an instructor. Can you see how this might be used in your discipline? And think about your content. In any way, you change the language around, change the questions around. Okay? You have Bloom's in front of you. We are all familiar with this, but sometimes I think we get away from this. So this is just a very colorful reminder of the levels of Bloom, and I want you to begin to realize that learning and questioning begin here. So I'm going to ask you to take just a moment, and not on the index card you've been provided, but maybe on the back side of your critical incident questionnaire, will you come up with questions at each of these levels on your discipline? So there's kind of a little cheat sheet in front of you, so there's terminology you can use, but if you can come up with one question for each of it, I'm going to give you about 45 seconds, very quickly, as much as you can get through, one question at each level in your discipline or content area. You jot those down for me, please? And they need to be in question format, not imperative statements. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and stop you there, but you see where I'm going with this. You're employed in your position because you're a master in your area. So my question to you is, was this a difficult task? You had to think about it. Yes, sir.
Moderately so.
Okay, moderately so. Were there some levels of blooms you found it more difficult to question? Where were those levels as you went up? Okay. So here's a question I'm posing to you as a fellow educator. So if you're having a difficulty as a professional in your field, how much difficulty would your students have in questioning at these different levels? So if the question doesn't begin with us and us posing the right questions, because it's not about the right answers, it's about the right questions, how in the world do we expect our students to be able to do that? So we begin to model this. What does this look like? What does this questioning look like at these different levels? It all begins with this. Here's what I found. I can tell you in observing teacher candidates at the secondary level, when we first come out to visit them, because they're so concerned with their students in the field having the right answers, they stay right down here at this level. Because what happens here? Just recall. They can open the book and there's the answer. And that's a safe way to question. Safe way to question. Where it begins to get risky is as you move up. Because you don't know what the answers are going to be. You know why? There's no one right answer. There's multiple ways to get at that. And that's where it's kind of scary, especially for a novice teacher. They're not sure where to go with this. They haven't anticipated if they respond this way, how do I follow up that with another question? Because it's difficult. Questioning is difficult. But again, it begins with us as educators to begin to frame those really important questions so we can push that learning and engage our students. Because I truly believe if you do nothing else but question well, you've engaged your students. I have no doubt about that. If nothing else, you've engaged them in thinking. Would you take a minute and watch? You've seen this, but I want you to watch it carefully.
Google, what is glossophobia?
Glossophobia, or speech anxiety, is the fear of public speaking.
Resolutely faithful to it.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth frankly and boldly. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
I have a question. You seen this commercial before? Sure you have. Let me invite you to pull up your blooms in front of you. Did we just not experience this in a minute and 6 seconds? What was the very first thing that started this commercial? Do you remember? What is glossophobia? Where is that on blooms? Woo. Definition, very bottom. Define. How did he locate what is glossophobia? How did he find the definition? Google. It's a Google commercial. By the time the commercial ended in a minute and 6 seconds, what had happened? Keep going. You're moving on up the blooms. Y'all chuckled when it happened.
Created speech. It was accepted positively, and he made a girl smile, so he went back down to, I can do something else.
Because what did he find out when he Googled something and found out how to do something? What ended up happening? Because applause was affirmation, good job. So what do you think is going to happen since he Googled how to ask a girl out? He's going to get the date. Do you see what's happened? He's transferred that to something completely different. He's going out on a date now. Isn't that what creating's about? So it's a Google commercial. I was watching that one day and I thought, that's Blooms. I don't know if Google knows that's Blooms, but that's Blooms. In a minute and 6 seconds that happened. And so I pulled this and I showed my teacher, Candace, let me show you how this works. I give you 50 minutes in the classroom to observe this happen. They did in a minute and 6 seconds. So that's what Blooms is about. So we showed them how this is a real concept. It's not a theory that was invented hundreds of years ago and all of a sudden we just keep using it because we say it's a good thing. It works. It happens. You use the technologies embedded there, but it still blooms. Okay. So now, you have a template. We're going to transition because we are going to engage you even further. You have a template in front of you. So everybody see the blue template? And I see some of you are like my typical secondary folks and are already manipulating it and touching it, even though you haven't been given instructions to do that. So here's what I need you to do. Only by looking. You can't do anything with the template except look at it. Okay? Just look at it. And again, for the sake of time, we're going to have to quickly go through this. All right? On one side of the index card that you've been provided with your packet, I want you to provide me instructions to get the person to shape this into what this template should be. You only can look at it, but I want you to provide some detailed instructions. How do I go about getting the shape I need to get out of this?
Will the student have this in front of them?
Yes, they will. And they will be doing just that. I'm going to see how this ties into questioning. They'll be doing just that. They'll have it in front of them. And this is something, again, think about your concept of what you're teaching, your discipline. How could you use something like this? I just happen to do this because we are all somewhat familiar with this. So provide instructions and how to get at the end product. You know what the end product's supposed to be. But just by looking at it, how do you do that? Okay, again, for the sake of time, I'm going to stop you there, but we can get a good start here. So here's what I want you to imagine. Imagine that template is your content. And you've just delivered your content to your students. All they've been able to do is look at it. So let's say, for example, you were just talking at them. And so the result was what's on your index card. So what I need you to do is swap to the person with you, give them your instructions, and the person even, I want you, you're going to have to play down with me on this. You have to follow exactly what they say. Even though you know differently, you follow their instructions verbatim.
Look at the long side and what is the long side?
Hey, good question. Follow their instructions verbatim, even though you may know how it ends up. Don't improvise on this. Dr. Hammond, do we have an engaged audience? Do we have an engaged audience? Okay, I'm going to ask you to stop where you are and just hold up what you have. Wherever you ended, hold up what you have. Okay. All right. Again, let's go back for a second because we're talking about student engagement. Once again, you've just presented your content, and that which was your template. Okay? And I've just assessed you based on you give me instructions of how to construct that. So the 100 on the test looks like this. Put your template back up. How many of you made 100? Put it back up. Okay, so go to the next one. Okay. So here we're going to talk about this for a second. We're going to talk about the learning. So put your templates down, your semi-boxes, cubes down. What problems did you encounter?
My very first one was I had written my instructions based on how it was laid in front of me, and I didn't add that to her instructions to say, make sure the structure is sitting a certain direction before you start.
Could that make a difference? Yeah. Absolutely, because the next step may not go the way it should go. Okay. Fold along the darkened lines. Okay, then do what after the fold along the darkened lines? What? Do when it comes natural. So here's what I want you to think about. So you have a student in your classroom who is unfamiliar with your content. And this is, again, I've tried to pull something that we so how do they access that? So I think too many times as instructors, we just kind of make the assumption, here's my content. Here's what I want it to look like when I finish presenting that. And we don't begin to think about, okay, what problems did they encounter? And so some of the problems was they didn't have the background knowledge they needed to have. And so we were able to pull that up to kind of build instruction off of that. Yes, something like this, it was pretty intuitive. Our content's not so much with our students, is it? It's not so intuitive.
That same description, and this could have been what happened.
Which is, and on the test, what does he make? He fails it, but I delivered my content. I did my job, I taught it. And so this is feedback back to me. All right, let's redirect here. What would have helped? Because all I told you to do, you could do is what? Just look at it. Now, the next step in here, we don't have time to do all this, but I'm going to say you can manipulate it now. Would that have helped? Pick it up, actually fold it. So as you're writing your instructions, you can tell them, because you're doing it as you're writing your instructions, so a little bit more likely to get it. Challenges, any challenges did you experience?
No, we didn't know what the result was supposed to be. We couldn't move completely.
Okay.
We all had the assumption that we would.
Okay. How many of you knew that it was going to end up being a cube in the end? May have seen this template, okay? So then this is very typical of your content. Their students in your classroom are going to know, they're going to just have the knowledge of your content for whatever reasons, all kinds of reasons why they know it. They're very interested in it. They've done their own research on it. They've got strong background, but others are not. So if we're talking about engaging all students, we've got to reach them all. So the one we don't reach, we didn't reach them all. So all these ways to begin to navigate, and I think this is, again, going back to self-reflection. We have students do this, okay? How did you know you're experiencing difficulty? I think we underestimate this power. Okay, I had a hard time with this. How did you know? Do you ever ask that question? When you hit a block wall with the content I'm trying to present to you and you can't go any further, do you know why? And if they don't know why, how are you going to help them? So you got to teach them how to articulate what is it they don't know that they need to know to get to the next piece of information you need to share with them, whatever your content is. So teaching them to ask the right questions. And too many times we just want to give them the answer, well, let me just have this and do it for them. And what kind of learning occurs? None. Because you give this template back to them, they're back to square one. And this is why, in my opinion, I don't want to get on a soapbox here, that we teach grammar all the way into college, even though they started in first grade. Okay, Dr. Kaiser.
This is what you gave us. Could we have had a completed cube at the end so they could have seen that as they were working with this, what that would have been?
That is what an effective instructor would do, but oftentimes here's what happens. We teach our content with no end in mind for the student. They don't know where we're going with this. Yes, that would, as an effective instructor, that's very beneficial. Part of what we do in secondary, and I'm speaking for us only, we use the Understanding by Design template, and that's actually a lesson plan template. That's actually in the student engagement textbook, and that's part of the premise behind that. Begin with the end in mind, planning backwards. So if I show you, here's a template, here's what I need it to look like at the end, would you have a better job of mastering that and it not looking like Dr. Conway's did? Probably, yes. But too many times we keep this a secret to our students.
My problem was I started out by telling them how to lay it horizontally, and then I went through and told them to number the lines, and then my instructions were folded on line whatever, 2 or 3 or whatever, and I was going to try and work my way up Bloom's taxonomy with my instructions, and I couldn't get off the bottom part.
Interesting.
Making it precise instruction.
Was it, you use the term horizontally. So if I were to use that term horizontally in a definition of my content, what if the student doesn't know what that means? What begins to happen to learning after that? You see, so sometimes that language we use is the barrier. That's it. So we begin to uncover those things, but oftentimes we are stuck at that level, at that bottom level. It's very difficult to move up. Asking these questions, teaching students how to self-reflect on their own learning. The reality is they're responsible for their learning also, but it's your job to kind of facilitate that. They don't know how to do this. You've got to teach them. And I think we're transparent about this. This is what learning looks like, folks. When you struggle and have difficulty, ask yourself, stop. Before you get to that frustration level, because no learning occurs when you're frustrated, stay in that productive struggle lane. So you stop. What's causing your frustration? How do you know this is happening? Well, because I don't know how to go any further. This is what's confusing. I mean, we kind of got to go backwards on this and figure out what this is. And students begin to do this with their own learning. Dr. Hammock? Okay, so we're going to skip here. We just talked about that, okay? So oftentimes, too, it begins to help. As you are going through the second round, the redo, where I can say, okay, now you can manipulate it, rewrite your instructions. And in addition to that, your person who wrote your instructions and the other person who's actually doing the end product can ask you questions. In other words, it's just not about me following the instruction. Now I can question back to you. It's for clarification purposes. So oftentimes if we're instructing and we're not engaging students and we're just putting information out there and not allowing time to allow them to ask us questions, learning stops there, because now they're just receiving information and don't even know where to file cabinet in their brain. So if they begin to ask questions, now, if I understand you correctly, is this what you mean? And then you confirm that, affirm that, and they kind of file that, and this is where that goes in my brain. And so these open-ended questions will allow them to do this. Again, we teach them how to do this. And I think how we teach that is we model that. We don't ask these closed-ended questions where they can answer yes or no and shut down the conversation. We use the how, the when, okay? All right, so the idea behind this, again, this should not have been a secret. You should have known this from the beginning. Now I want you to write instructions. Let's say, for example, I'm going about my content. Here's what the end product's supposed to be. Now, as I begin to present the lesson to you with the activities I have involved in there, you know where I'm going with this. So you can kind of begin to kind of use what you know and all this new learning to get to this end product. But too many times we get stuck here. We just have the template. And we present the knowledge that way. Well, what is a student supposed to do with that template? That's our job, to help them get to that end product. But again, it shouldn't be a mystery. It shouldn't be a mystery. One of the things I look for when I go observe our teacher candidates is I'm looking for you to state your objectives verbally and somewhere where they can go back and revisit it during the lesson. Your students need to know where they're going, why you're doing what you're doing. I use that term, if it's cute, it's got to count. I'm all for activities that are engaging, but it's also got to count. It can't just because you got off of Pinterest. And too many times that's happening. Okay. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this thinking through quality questioning. This is probably one of the most powerful things I experienced. I actually had the opportunity in one of our school board conferences to sit in the session, and they were talking about this thinking through quality questioning. And I thought, this is what I want my classroom to look like. So if you look at the center, the nurture, the culture of thinking. This is something, to think about a culture. It doesn't just happen overnight. You've got to create that. So there are aspects, and we'll talk about those in a minute, of how you make that happen. But the first thing you've got to do to get at the center is you've got to frame these quality questions. Well, those are things that you just, if you don't have knowledge and really deep knowledge about your content, you're going to be unable to do that. So you've got to really think deeply about your content and also who your students are. Because depending on the students you have, your questions will change. If they have really deep content knowledge about what you're teaching already, you're not going to need to go so much on the lower level of blooms. You can start in the middle and move on up. And keep in mind, folks, this is not that you start at the bottom, move up, and that's the way it goes. You're bouncing back and forth, aren't you? Okay? So if you find yourself spending most of your time on one level and the other, I challenge you to kind of push yourself as an educator to think, how can you engage students at these other levels of bloom? And what this begins to do when you frame not just questions, the key word here is quality questions, that you kind of strengthen students' thinking. It kind of stretches them because first of all, these questions are engaging. It makes me think about myself and how I kind of can relate to this content, your content personally. You facilitate feedback, and we're going to talk about how you can facilitate feedback based on their thinking and your questioning in just a minute. And then you wrote responsibility. And notice how this is spelled, the ability to respond. I will begin to talk about the wait time 1 and 2 here in just a minute. But that's kind of the cycle, the framework for this thinking through quality questioning. And if any of you would like more information on this, I would be glad to share this with you. This is just kind of enough to whet your appetite. So very quickly, we were just talking about this earlier. When we first started, I posed a question to you, and there's nothing but silence. Do you guys remember that? And I said, I'm going to come back to this. We were engaged in what we call wait time 1. Many of us are familiar with that. I pose a question as the instructor, and we sit there and look at each other. And sometimes it gets to be awkward silence. When it starts feeling that way, you kind of got to move on, because then nothing's happening, okay? So you kind of got to get a sense of the feel when they're kind of getting frustrated, because you can see that they just don't get it. But we have to give them that time, because when we give that wait time 1, once I pose the question, first of all, several things happen. How many of you have been in the classroom where a question was posed, and before the question was posed, the teacher called on the student? What happened to everybody else in that classroom? They just quit thinking. They stopped. Why? Dr. Wilson. And all of a sudden everybody shut down. I'm not Dr. Wilson. So I put her, now what's happened? Her heart's gone. Right? And how much thinking can occur because it's safe? Not much. So I posed my question. And I allow everybody the opportunity to think about that. Sir, yes.
I just wanted to say what I have found, at least in my teaching, that there is a social resistance to answering questions at all, no matter how well posed. What are your ideas about that?
And I think it goes back to creating that culture. It's not going to happen overnight, I can tell you that. And I can give you a perfect example of that. I've known classrooms, I've been in classrooms, I tend to feel like I can promote that classroom of thinking where you have students, the same exact students, who will engage in questioning all day long, and they go in another classroom and they shut down. So I think, to be honest with you, and I hate to keep putting it back on us, but at the end of the day, it is on us. It's part of our responsibility to promote that culture. And I think part of this is a safety thing. I don't want to blame it on generations, because I can believe, I don't care what the generation is, you can get students engaged. So I think it's this culture, and it doesn't happen overnight. And you tell them, you show them the process. Once again, I don't know what it is about this, but these ideas of theories, I think you break it down so students can it's palatable to them. But you tell them, this is what I want to create, this culture of thinking. Here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to frame questions, and here's why I frame these quality questions, so you can think through that. And when you think through that, I'm going to respond to that, and as you show them that. And then as they're engaging in that in your classroom, you stop, and where are we at with this? We're at responsibility, let's say, for example. And so you show them, and they begin to kind of buy into that. I mean, I have experienced that firsthand. So I think it's one of those things, it's not one magic thing, here's how you do this, check it off the list, you just kind of got to play with it. And some semesters will be better than others based on the dynamics of your students. But you as an instructor, I think, can play a huge role in that, creating that culture. I do realize there's students that I don't care what you do, they're not going to respond to questions. But you put them beside somebody that can kind of foster that, it begins to they want to be a part of it. And I've seen that happen too. So wait time 1. I pose the question. Everybody has an opportunity to think about that. I don't rob anybody the opportunity of learning. Okay? Now, Dr. Johns, after everybody's thought, now I've called on her. Okay? So Dr. Johns gives me a response. Here's where wait time 2 kicks in. And this is where I think as an educator as a whole we fail. Okay? Because as soon as Dr. Johns responds, we want to give her an answer. Once again, we rob the opportunity of Dr. Johns to self-reflect on what she just said to me. We also rob the students of opportunity to think about what Dr. John just said and navigate what they thought the answer was, because they've already, remember, I didn't call on anybody, so they already had an answer formulated in their head. And so now, okay, well, Dr. Johns thought this, but I thought this. Do you see what begins to happen? But I see what she's thinking here. And now this is happening. It also helps me as a person that posed the question to think about, what do you think about, that's not where I was going with that. How can I respond back to that and keep this conversation going? And so that wait time 2 begins to happen. There's actually 2 parts of that. So one is the pause after you've given the question to allow you to reflect as a person that responded, and then also your peers, and also for your peers to compare it to what they thought also. How many of you can say, without a doubt, wait time 2, I'm on it? I do it all the time. Doctor? What is it? I'm sorry, couldn't I?
The conversation goes back and forth and it builds and crescendo. The waiting time would seem to me to dampen the natural responses.
Excellent observation. Here's why I think that happens. That oftentimes happen when many times the learners are high level, they already know the content, and so they're eager to respond, they know it, but what begins to happen, again, you're going to find yourself, depending on what your concept is and your topic you're presenting, how complex it is, your wait time may not need to be what it needs to be at certain times, and depending, again, on your students you have in that period or class. If they have high knowledge of what your content is, you're not going to need as much as this. We're talking about engaging all students. So I'm thinking about students from here to here. But I do see how that happens, but I also think it's important, even in those situations, to stop them and explain to them why this is happening. And I tell them, here's why nobody's talking, because I want you thinking, and I want to think about what you've just said to me too. So I don't want you to rob me of the opportunity to think about learning too, because I can learn from you too. But you tell them what you're doing. And I think that's what's frustrating for many students is things happen to them and at them, and they're not a part of that process. But if I can tell them, here's why I do this, they may still not buy into it, but there's a rationale, and I promise you're going to have a few more jump on board, so I get that. And they can begin to transfer that learning to their other classes where they don't have instructors doing what you've just done. And they learn, you know what, he didn't call on me, she didn't call on me, but I'm supposed to be thinking right now about that question that wasn't posed to me.
I think the other part is being effective instructor allows people's opinions and voices to be heard.
And I think
encourages the disposition to talk to the class.
Exactly, and I think it empowers the students because it's just not me knowing all the answers. You guys are learning and answering each other. And pretty soon, again, I just serve as a facilitator. I'm just facilitating the learning. They don't realize, I mean, it's a lot of work, folks, trust me. It's a lot of work, you know that, into going into, but they don't need to see all that. They just need to see that, you know what, this is a natural flow, and learning shouldn't be that hard in that way. We shouldn't make it so difficult that there's this mystery there. And I think, you know, we as instructors are just transparent with them. Here's what's going on. Here's what learning looks like. In case nobody's told you, we're about to, and we stop in the middle of the learning to let them know. And once you begin to kind of move that culture to where you want it to be in your classroom, there's no more of this instructing. It's just happening. It's just happening. Okay? So I challenge you to kind of pose that wait time too. Again, at the beginning, especially if you've not done this, it's kind of uncomfortable. We kind of look at each other. And I think it's one of those things as instructors, the last thing you need to do is kind of steer off. You need to make that eye contact with them because they need to know that you're engaged too. You know, if I begin to, okay, I want you to think about that and I'm at my computer, what does that tell them? That I already know it, I don't need to know it, don't really care what you think about it, but I need to finish taking attendance, whatever it is you're doing. So you be engaged as much as they are.
So you're saying that you should explain all this to the students before you do it, because I can understand if I were a student.
I'm just questioning now, I'm learning from you here. So have you been, I'm thinking about all your different experiences in the classroom, has this been something that's happened within your classroom where you tell them, you know, here's what we're doing here and here's why we're doing this. And it has nothing to do with my content, it just has everything to do with you accessing my content. Does that make sense? Have you just talked that candidly with students in your classroom?
Do you mean reveal why it is you're having the session the way it is?
Possibly. You do?
Then I would say sometimes.
Sometimes, okay. Those times you do it, do you see something more meaningful with your students as far as learning or engagement than the times you don't? And this is part of our self-reflection as instructors. Sometimes?
I don't know the answer.
Okay, all right.
My experience has been a little different because we're an online program, so I'm not really speaking about our program, but from a face-to-face standpoint, I take Sunday school class and carefully consider everybody else's response when it's a class. So it's kind of without me having to say it.
Right.
I'm going to think about your response.
Right.
I'm openly considering it, talking out loud, and understanding it's the process.
You know, you know as well as I do that, you know, JSU has many first-generation students. So they're learning this college thing on their own. And so I think part of what, you know, they've not had, you know, people maybe in their family who's been able to talk through, here's how you handle, because it's very different than secondary classroom, you know, a lot of autonomy on their area where it's their responsibility to kind of figure out how they learn this information. So oftentimes, again, this is not, I'm not saying blanketly do this all the time, every time with you've got to know your students. As Dr. Hammett was saying, if I'd had a student that I knew, if I looked them straight in the eye, whether it be a cultural issue or you know, personality issue, and they found that as a challenge, I would never do that. So I would want to have knowledge of students to do that. But other students that I know that I've got to make eye contact, and that's kind of our nonverbal way of saying, I know you got it, and we keep moving on. And so again, it goes that knowledge of students, but we're engaged that way without any language of discourse being transferred. So some of the norms of questioning in your classroom, I just want you to think about, you know, how often is this happening in your classroom? Pose questions that prompt thinking. Notice not looking for the right answer, but prompt the thinking. That may not ever lead to the right answer, but we're prompting thinking, okay? Which oftentimes will lead to further questions.
I just have to make a comment.
Sure.
We move out of the age of accountable level of this Bloom's taxonomy so they can figure out multiple choice questions.
And you've got a point there. And I will say, don't you think, though, as scary as that may be for the P through 12 teachers, if I create this type of classroom where I'm promoting critical thinking, we go back to what our text says about motivation and the act of learning. You know, the motivation to me is it's going to be one of those things that, you know, I may go back and learn at that lower level, but you're still pushing me for all these other different areas. And I think sometimes that's where we lose that love of learning with students, is because we've just pushed at the recall, and that's no fun. You know, after I've answered that to you 100 times, in 3 different years, and you're still asking me the same question. There's no challenge there. I'm not motivated. I get nothing out of that. But to push that to think, you know, this learning could look different in different situations, and it can help you outside of the classroom in which you're sitting right now. But yes, I can see how for that second, when we talk about those things openly, you know, how do you begin to, you know, push that idea of critical thinking? I mean, critical thinking looks lots of different ways depending on your discipline. You kind of create this classroom where it's risk-free. You know, you ever heard that? That's a stupid question. I'm not going to ask that. Have you ever heard your students ever comment that or say that under their breath? You know, we always tell them what's our automatic response? No such thing as a stupid question, okay? So something's happened to them where they've kind of felt like, you know, the idea they shut down, they're not going to respond. And maybe that's not why they don't respond. Whenever they have responded, instructors have maybe made them feel like it was a stupid question. And I can tell you, students will shut down just like that when that begins to happen. Whether you say it verbally, your actions will speak louder than words when you just move on and don't even dismiss what they say. It could be the wrong answer, but there's something about that if nothing else, so what makes you think that? And it kind of leads up to maybe uncover misconceptions they have about your content that you would have never otherwise got at. Yes?
I was going to say, I think students today fear the social risk of being wrong. They don't want to give a wrong answer. I've noticed that.
So are there ways you could frame questions so there are no wrong answers but still get them to master the standard at the end of the day? Can that happen? That's just something I'm asking you. Okay?
I would say some of the time.
Some of the time.
But there is a body of...
Other things we want to do is obviously welcome opportunities to make mistakes. I mean, think about this in your own personal life. Forget the academics. Aren't those times you made those mistakes the best learning experiences you've ever had? And so why don't we allow them to take these academic risks and fail? And it's okay. And those are learning, and teach them how you learn from that. Embed follow-up questions. We were talking about this earlier, Dr. Conway and I, is oftentimes we have this, slew of questions, really quality question I'm going to ask, but we haven't taken a step further and anticipated how our students might respond. Because now we've got to think about, and after that's happened, we've anticipated how they're going to respond. Now what do I say back to them? Instead of it being off the cuff and you really didn't think they were going to say that, and now what do? You've already thought through that. Okay, because again, knowledge of students is based, you have to know that. Because I know my students, I realize some of them might say this. So when they say this, here's how I'm going to respond back to them with a question. And it kind of gets a cycle of thinking and questioning going on. And so it begins to, again, extend to their responses and thinking. And lastly, encourage wonder, not the right answer. I know sometimes some of this seems kind of Pollyanna, but I wonder why you said that. Do you see what begins to happen? It pushes back, they're like, I don't know why I said that either. Let me think why. And so it's not about I'm wrong. It just makes me think, and going back to self-reflection, because I think this is key. It goes hand in hand. You can't question without self-reflecting. Okay, and this is something I've put right there in front of their face when we talk about questioning. So here's what happens. And by the way, I've got to pull this out because I brought this illustration. Does this look familiar to anybody? This shape? Okay, what is this, first of all, what does this remind you of that you have in front of you? Okay, so I want you to think about this for a second. Because now this is the way a funnel should go, right? So what is right here, based on Bloom's? Okay, what is down here? Okay, think about the purpose of a funnel. If everything stays right in here and nothing comes out, does it serve its purpose? So what happens, if you stay in the remember and recall, you see what begins to happen? It's got to get down here for it to have any meaning. So think about this. I think there's a specific reason why this is shaped in the way it is. Think about what a funnel does. This is where the meat comes in. This is where the learning comes in. This is where the creation comes in. This learning recall stuff, we can do this all day long. There's nothing for me to advance my learning and thinking. Nothing. I don't want to know more about anything else because I already know it. I'm right here. But this is what I want to know more. And what begins to happen once you create something, it goes back in. It's just like the cycle. So that's a really good visual, too, that I showed my students to show them. And next time they pull out a funnel, because we're talking about college students, right? They'll think about Bloom's taxonomy. Okay? But I do walk them through this. Okay, I ask you a question, you receive it. Here's what I need you to do with it. Now I want you to bring this to your working memory to decode what I just said, because I'm going to be able to think, okay, do I even know the vocabulary the instructor just posed with that question? And maybe I don't, so I'm going to stop there, because I don't even know where to go with this. And so you can kind of begin to know this, and then you remember when I said, how do you know I was experiencing difficulty? You remember that question? I didn't understand the vocabulary. I knew that, okay? And then I tell them what's going to begin to happen now. After you bring the question to your working memory, you're going to search your long-term memory for any relevant knowledge. So I'm going to pull everything I know about what you just posed, and I'm going to pull that together. And then what begins to happen, again, we're just being posed a question, you're going to take that relevant knowledge to that working memory, and you're going to create that response. Remember that wait time 1? So that's what's happened. That's where you are right now. You formed your response. And now we're ready to answer the question. It's not easy to answer a question, a quality question. Do you see what begins to happen? And I take them through this. So I ask them a question. So where are we now, right now? I'm searching for my long-term memory, and they know where they are. Okay, are we ready to form a response? Okay, now let's answer the question. And again, this is not something we cannot, but you teach them how to do this, so now it begins just as how when they hear a question, they have it. Habits of the mind.
So you're teaching a form of metacognition.
Yes, ma'am. And I think you're transparent about that. Sorry, click this. Okay, very quickly, just again, talk about thinking and questioning because you can't separate the two. We talked about planning for questioning, anticipate follow-up questions, be intentional in language. I think we use that Bloom's, use the language there, and tell them where they are with this. Not again that you want to get so bogged down and we're on level 1, but you talk about where this is and where we're going with this and how it's important for you to have this base knowledge because how in the world you can create something if I don't even know what the language is. So we've got to start somewhere. But at the same time, if you know that you've got a class that really has a really good base and your knowledge of your content, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that bottom. We might just quickly review over that to make sure we're on the same page and we begin to move forward. Monitor academic behavior, and that's one of the things, again, we talk about creating this risk-free environment. You see, to me, one of the greatest disservices we can do as educators is allow one student in your class to dominate conversations. That will shut students in your class off quicker than anything else you can do. Quicker than the teacher saying you're wrong. Is you allow one, because what's going to happen is you ask a question, nobody's thinking because you're going to call on that one person, or if not, you don't call on them, you're going to allow them, because we allow that, by the way, allow them to dominate that conversation, and they get all the learning, and everybody else is just spectators. And they paid a whole lot of money for your class. So that's our job, too, I believe, to monitor that with open-mindedness and risk-taking again. I cannot underestimate the power of risk-taking. I mean, it's an exhilarating thing to academically to do that. Even in our personal lives, you talk about some things that you've never done before. Walk up to a stranger and engage in conversation. That's risk-taking, isn't it? I mean, they could reject you and turn away and just, but maybe not. What if that's your soulmate? That could happen, right? Okay, some of you may or not have seen this. This is from the Danielson framework. Comes from the right question. Some of you may be familiar with that also. But I think this is something that we can kind of use as a rubric to think about when we begin to question. Okay, do I have a quality question? Here's how you rate that. We're going to kind of say we want to be distinguished, right? We're not even shooting for any of these other areas. So we're looking for the max out. So how do you do that? Teachers' questions are uniformly high quality, adequate time for students to respond, because that's known as what? 1 and 2, okay? And students formulate questions on their own. So they're just not looking for the answers. They're formulating questions that feed off of your questions. Talks about discussion techniques. They assume considerable responsibility for the success of discussion. They initiate topics and make unsolicited contributions. In other words, you don't have to ask them. They're going to tell you. They're so engaged in your content. And lastly, we talk about student participation, the Danielson framework. Students themselves ensure that all voices are heard in discussion. In other words, you no longer have to shut down that person that talks all the time. The students will do it for you because they realize they've got a right to have a voice too. So when you've created that kind of environment with student participation, because everyone has a right to learn, they begin to kind of manage that. And I've seen that happen too. But again, they have to know you as a teacher that's going to allow that to happen, to create that culture. Dr. Henry? So, in the end of the day, it's not about giving the right answer, but about asking the right questions. So I hope I've engaged you. Okay, yes.
Can you bring all this back to the Socratic method of questioning and teaching that way? Do you think this is all related to Socrates? I said Socrates in the beginning.
Yes.
And I, as a student here, wanted some affirmation. 1 hour ago.
So here's what I'm going to do. Pose your question again, Dr. Webb.
Well, when you asked in the beginning, what did your title of your session remind people of? Shakespeare was brought up, and I said Socrates. So I've sat here now for an hour, and I haven't had my affirmation. The question I have is, do you think that all of this goes into the Socratic method of asking questions and teaching in that mode?
So I'm going to empower your colleagues I ask one of you to respond to that question.
Help, I need affirmation before I leave.
This is that wait time one, by the way. We're there.
Are you waiting for us to respond?
To me.
Right, but one of us to say something. Okay. You said that being a teacher is questioning. So therefore, Socratic method is one way of getting at that. So even though they were using different language, I think they were talking about the same thing.
And I want to tell you this, Dr. Webb, and I'm going to leave it at this because we could go all day long on this. You talked about affirmation, and I think that's one of the fallacies of educating is we depend on the instructor to affirm you. And who ultimately is responsibility is that?
Dr. Kaiser to me.
Dr. Isn't that the student's responsibility? Because I've put all this out to you, so now you tell me based on what you know, what you've been presented, have you been affirmed?
I have, yeah.
Okay.
I believe what you're asking is like a philosophical question too about knowledge in general.
Yep.
I mean, does knowledge exist for itself, or does it exist in individuals? Do they create it themselves? And I think if you're going to be an effective teacher, you've got to understand that knowledge exists inside students themselves. They create that knowledge. They may use it for themselves. So I think that you're right. That this effective question
Yep.
is the focus of good teaching, because that's where knowledge is created, and that's where it is within all of us. If we're not here, what is knowledge?
And then I had one other question though, before we leave. If I were in a Montessori school and given this, would the teacher have simply said to me, create something from this?
Probably. Probably.
Yeah. And none of them would be wrong, right?
That's right. That's right. I was kind of basing that little cube on here's what the standard, the objective of your lesson was. You know, so this is what the end should look like. Okay, any other questions or comments?
I do. I think I see a difference with our students when they come from the general studies classes of their first 2 years, where there's a lot of just learning the knowledge and facts on that basic level. And over a period of time, as they get more comfortable in the environment where they can engage, where they can pose questions, they go from, you know, this long periods of silence when you're trying to pull them out to by the time they're getting ready to go to internship, you can practically turn the class over to them. They'll teach it because they are comfortable doing that. So it kind of takes time, and even within one semester, it's going to look different from the first of the semester to the very end.
That's right.
It's a process.
And I can tell you from an educational perspective, you know, I'm in the education department. It's all about execution. You can have this beautiful lesson plan. Buddy, I've thought about every student in my classroom, but you get up there and you have all this content knowledge, beautiful lesson plan, and they haven't learned a thing in your classroom. So part of that is begin to kind of navigate the practice, you know, with the theory in this. So, you know, how do I know when learning is occurring? And when it's not occurring, do I stop right there and shift gears? Because that's what you need to do. You know, that 50 minutes you have with them, I'm talking from secondary perspective, you don't get that back. There's no do-overs on that. And so I think that's part of what our job is you know, to let them know that, you know, ultimately there's the learning, you know, I'm the facilitator. I'm going to present this instruction to you in many different ways. Again, as I was talking with that template there, if others of you could have manipulated, you probably could have gotten it. And so that kind of just reinforces to us as educators, we just can't give our content and present that in one way. Multiple ways. Some will get it that way and be just fine because they have that knowledge. Many of you already knew I was supposed to be a cube at the end. I knew. But what about the ones that didn't? Where do they start?